At 13 years old, Louis Vuitton left his mountain village in France with almost nothing and began walking toward Paris. The city was 400 kilometers away. He had no money, no map, and no guarantee that anyone in Paris would ever hire him. The journey took 2 years. He stopped along the road to work odd jobs, earned just enough to keep moving, and arrived in the French capital with barely anything left. That same boy, ragged, exhausted, and completely unknown, would go on to create the most copied luxury brand in the world. Today, the LV monogram is recognized on every continent. Every year, thousands of factories produce counterfeit versions of his designs because no luxury symbol on earth is worth more to replicate. And it all started with a 13-year-old who walked 400 kilometers because staying home felt worse than the unknown. But this isn't a story about luggage. It's about a system. Before Louis Vuitton, traveling in luxury meant accepting that your most valuable possessions would arrive crushed, waterlogged, or stolen. He changed that. And in doing so, he created a brand that didn't just sell bags. It sold the idea that how you arrive matters as much as where you're going. If you're into real stories of power, money, and transformation, subscribe. Because this story didn't begin in a boutique on the Champs-Élysées. It began on a dirt road in the mountains of eastern France, where a boy chose the unknown over a future he couldn't accept. Louis Vuitton was born in 1821 in the village of Angers, a small, isolated community tucked into the Jura Mountains of eastern France. His early years were marked by loss that arrived before he was old enough to understand it. His mother died when he was a young child, and his father eventually remarried. The relationship between Louis and his stepmother deteriorated quickly, turning the home he had known into a place he needed to escape. Most boys his age stayed in Angers. The village offered limited work, but it was familiar and safe. Louis chose differently. At 13, he packed what little he had and began walking west toward Paris, the city that represented everything his village could not offer. The road was not a journey of weeks. It took almost 2 years. He stopped in towns along the route, working as a laborer, an errand boy, whatever task was available. He slept in rough conditions, earned barely enough to eat, and kept moving. By the time he arrived in Paris at 15, the boy from the mountains had already demonstrated the quality that would define his entire life. He would not stop. Arriving in Paris with almost nothing, Louis found work with a craftsman named Monsieur Maréchal, a professional packer and trunk maker who served the wealthiest families in the city. This was a real profession in 19th century Paris. The aristocracy needed trusted experts to carefully pack their most valuable possessions for extended travel and to build the trunks that would protect those belongings across months-long journeys. Louis absorbed everything. He learned how different materials behaved under pressure, how moisture destroyed leather and fabric, and how poor construction made even expensive luggage unreliable. Over the following years, he developed a reputation for precision and craftsmanship that spread through the most elite circles in the city. By 17, his skills had reached the attention of the imperial court. He was appointed personal trunk maker and packer to Empress Eugénie, the wife of Napoleon III. For a boy who had arrived from the mountains with nothing, it was an almost impossible rise. But Louis had not come to Paris to stay in someone else's workshop forever. In 1854, Louis Vuitton opened his own workshop near the Place Vendôme in Paris, one of the most prestigious addresses in France. What he offered was different from anything on the market. Most trunks of that era had curved tops, a practical design for water runoff, but one that made stacking completely impossible during long journeys by ship or rail. Louis created a flat-top trunk. It seemed like a small change. The consequences were enormous. Flat tops could be stacked efficiently. They could be stored in tight ship cabins. They could travel across oceans and arrive in the same condition they left. He then introduced a canvas coating that made his trunks waterproof and far lighter than the leather-covered alternatives his competitors sold. The combination of practicality, durability, and elegance attracted clients from across Europe and eventually from around the world. Within years, the waiting list for a Louis Vuitton trunk included royalty, industrialists, and artists. The boy who had walked into Paris with nothing was now building luggage for empresses. But success created a new and dangerous problem. Counterfeiters began copying his designs almost immediately, and the copies were good enough to fool buyers who didn't look closely. In 1896, 4 years after Louis died, his son Georges Vuitton introduced the solution that would make the brand immortal. He created the now iconic LV monogram canvas, the interlocking initials and floral pattern that covered every piece. The design was specific enough to be immediately recognizable and difficult enough to replicate perfectly that it stood as both a signature and a shield. The monogram became one of the most valuable visual symbols in history. Today, it is estimated that the overwhelming majority of Louis Vuitton products sold worldwide are counterfeit. Not because the brand has failed, but because no symbol in luxury carries more perceived value. Every fake is, in a strange way, proof of how completely Louis succeeded. Louis Vuitton died in 1892 without fully seeing the empire his work would become. He never stood inside a flagship store on the Champs-Élysées. He never saw his monogram covering every market from Tokyo to Sao Paulo. What he left behind was something more durable than any trunk he ever built: a standard, a belief that the way an object is made and the care taken to protect what matters can become the foundation of something the world refuses to stop wanting. The contrast is almost incomprehensible. A 13-year-old boy walking alone through the French mountains, working odd jobs to survive, arrived in Paris with nothing and created the most recognized luxury symbol on earth. Not through inheritance, not through connections, but through 2 years of walking, a lifetime of watching, and an obsession with solving a problem nobody else had bothered to fix. Subscribe for more stories like this, because some of the world's biggest empires were built by people who simply refused to stop moving.